This weekend, we saw a peaceful democratic election in France, one of our key Western allies and a bedrock of European stability after two terrible wars in the last century. And what happened just before the Sunday election in France? Well, there was a massive cyber attack on the leading candidate, the one who prevailed, Emmanuel Macron. And who do experts suspect was behind this cyber attack, trying to manipulate another Western election? Trying to foster mistrust in that nation's democratic institutions? Not surprisingly, Russia. Yet, none of this should surprise anyone. Not only had Russia been subsidizing Mr. Macron's opponent, Marine Le Pen, who was seen as more sympathetic to Moscow, not to mention trying to interfere in Dutch and German elections as well, but we were warned about this by our own intelligence agencies 6 months ago. In early October last year, the U.S. intelligence community detailed Russia's attack on America's election and warned us that other attacks would follow. During a recent trip to Eastern Europe, a Polish security expert warned me that if the United States didn't respond to an attack on its own presidential election by the Russians, Putin would feel emboldened to keep up the attacks to undermine and manipulate elections all through the free world. So what has this administration and this Congress done to respond to this cyber act of war by the Russians against America's democracy? Has President Trump clearly acknowledged Russia's attack on the U.S. and forcefully condemned the actions? No. Has President Trump warned Russia to stop meddling in the United States and other democratic elections in France, Germany, and other countries? No. Has President Trump proposed a plan to help the United States thwart any future attack on the next election and to help our states protect the integrity of their voting systems? No. Has the Republican-led Congress passed sanctions on Russia in response to this attack on our democracy? Has it passed meaningful cybersecurity legislation? No. Quite simply, the failure of this president and Congress to address this security threat is a stunning abdication of responsibility to protect the United States and our democratic values. Mr. President, as if the conclusions of 17 U.S. intelligence agencies weren't enough to raise concern, let's review what emerged just over the recent April recess. For example, Reuters reported that a Russian government think tank controlled by Russian dictator Vladimir Putin developed a plan to swing our 2016 presidential election to Donald Trump and undermine voters' faith in our electoral system. The institute, run by a retired senior Russian foreign intelligence official appointed by Putin, released two key reports, one in June and one in October last year. In the first, it argued that, quote, the Kremlin launched a propaganda campaign on social media and Russian state-backed global news outlets to encourage U.S. voters to elect a president who would take a softer line toward Russia than the administration of then-President Obama. The second warning said, quote, presidential candidate Hillary Clinton was likely to win the election. For that reason, it argued, it was better for Russia to end its pro-Trump propaganda and instead intensify its message about voter fraud to undermine the U.S. electoral system's legitimacy and damage Clinton's reputation in an effort to undermine her presidency. It was also recently disclosed, Mr. President, that the FBI obtained a foreign intelligence surveillance court warrant to monitor the communications of former Trump campaign foreign policy advisor Carter Page on the suspicion that he was a Russian agent. Add this to the ever-growing list of suspicious relationships between those in the Trump circle and Russia, from Michael Flynn to Paul Manafort to Roger Stone to Felix Sater. In fact, just last month, House Intelligence Committee Chair, Republican Jason Chaffetz, and ranking Democratic member Elijah Cummings said General Flynn may have broken the law by failing to disclose on his security clearance forms payments of more than $65,000 from companies linked to Russia. Yet, incredibly, the White House continues to stonewall requests for documents related to General Flynn. White House ethics lawyer during the George Bush administration, Richard Painter, wrote of this stonewalling, quote, "U.S. House must subpoena the docs. Zero tolerance for White House cover-up of foreign payoffs," end of quote. Is it any wonder why, in recent testimony to Congress, FBI Director Comey acknowledged an investigation of Russian interference in our election, which he said included possible links between Russia and Trump associates? Mr. President, finally, over the recess, on tax day to be precise, there were nationwide protests calling on President Trump to take the necessary step to dispel concerns by releasing his taxes once and for all. The concern over his taxes goes to a serious question as to how much Russian money is part of the Trump business empire. In 2008, Donald Trump Jr. said Trump's businesses, quote, "see a lot of money pouring in from Russia," close quote. This despite his father incredibly saying just a few months ago, quote, "I have nothing to do with Russia. No deals, no loans, no nothing," end of quote. It appears that the Russians were some of the few willing to take on the financial risk required to invest in the Trump precarious business deals. Any such Russian money, combined with the president's refusal to formally separate himself from his business operations during his presidency, demands the release of his tax return. Trump's response to the mounting calls to release these returns, the usual, is to attack everyone asking questions and blithely dismiss the issue as being irrelevant. Of course, the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee had compelling testimony yesterday from former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates and former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper. Ms. Yates discussed the urgent warning that she delivered to the White House counsel on January 26th that the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States, General Flynn, had been compromised and was subject to blackmail by the Russians. It was a warning she repeated in 2 meetings and a phone call. What did the White House do in response to the acting attorney general warning them that the highest advisor in the White House on national security could be blackmailed by the Russians? Nothing. For 18 days, General Flynn continued to staff President Trump for a phone call with Vladimir Putin and other highly sensitive national security matters. Think of that. After being warned by the Attorney General that the man sitting in the room with you, the highest level of national security advisor, could be compromised by the Russians, President Trump continued to invite General Flynn for 18 days in that capacity. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said, and I quote, "When the president heard the information as presented by White House counsel, he instinctively thought that General Flynn did not do anything wrong. And the White House counsel's review corroborated that," end of quote. Let's be clear. It's bad enough to have a national security advisor who's subject to blackmail by the Russians. The fact that the Trump White House didn't see that as an urgent problem is deeply troubling. I'm glad the Senate Crime and Terrorism Subcommittee held this hearing yesterday, but the occasional subcommittee hearing is not enough. Let's make sure we know for the record. That subcommittee, chaired by Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina, and Ranking Member Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, did yeoman's duty, not just yesterday, but in a previous hearing, without being allocated any additional resources for this investigation. Without being given additional staff, they have brought to the attention of the American people some important facts about what transpired in the Trump White House after it was clear that General Flynn had been compromised by the Russians. But the occasional subcommittee hearing like this is not enough. We need an independent, bipartisan commission with investigative resources and the power necessary to dig into all of the unanswered questions. And until we do, the efforts of this committee or that committee is not enough. It has to be a conscious effort on a national basis by an independent commission. For President Trump, these issues do not appear to be relevant. Yet there's a simple way to resolve the many questions that are before us. First, Mr. President, disclose your tax returns. Clear up, among other questions, what your son said in 2008 about a lot of Russian money pouring into your family business. Number two, answer all the questions about campaign contacts with the Russians, including your former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, and former Foreign Policy Advisor, Carter Page. Three, quite simply, explain the reports of repeated contacts between your campaign operatives and Russian intelligence. Number four, answer all the questions about your close friend Roger Stone's comments that suggest he had knowledge of WikiLeaks having and using in strategically timed releases when your campaign was struggling, information that had been hacked by the Russians from your opponent's campaign. Number five, explain your ties to Russian-born businessman Felix Sater, who worked at the Bayrock Group investment firm that partnered with your business and had ties to Russian money. Number six, provide all requested documents to Congress related to Michael Flynn, who concealed his payments from Russian interest. Mr. President, if there's nothing to hide, this is your chance to clear up things once and for all. And to my Republican colleagues, I say again, these Russian connections may constitute a national security crisis. We need to have the facts. How long will we wait for these desperately needed answers before we establish an independent commission investigation, as we've done when faced with previous attacks on America? Finally, how long will we sit by before passing additional sanctions on Russia for their cyber attack on the United States of America? That attack makes November 8th of 2016 a day that will live in cyber infamy in America's history. It's time for the Republicans and the Democrats to show the appropriate concern for this breach of our national security. We have a bipartisan Russian sanctions bill ready to go in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What are we waiting for?